Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second episode of Labor of Love. I'm Shivangani, the CEO and founder of Feather and Bone. So I was pregnant with my son about 2 years now. I can't believe we're almost there at 2 years old. It's crazy. But when I was getting ready for his birth, a lot of the birth stories I found were just either too perfect or too scary, and I couldn't find the middle. And I couldn't even reach out to the moms after I heard the stories. And so I thought this would be a way to help first-time mummies to hear the full spectrum of stories from mummies who've gone through it once, twice, maybe more, and ask questions. So today we have a mum who has a baby that's similar to my son, Kate. And we have a mum who has two preteen daughters, right? Preteen?
One preteen and one 6.5 year old.
6.5. So she's gone through it twice. So we're going to hear Kate's story first. So Kate, take it away.
Thanks so much for having me. I remember when I was researching, I read Ina May's Guide to Childbirth. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but what was really influential is that it was just all of these different stories of the ways that birth could go. And that was really, really helpful for me because, like you said, we only get these two sides of the spectrum of like the orgasmic birth or the one where everything goes wrong. And everybody has such an individual experience. Looks like we might have someone.
Yeah.
Hi, Lubna. Nice to meet you. We are just getting into the birth story, and Kate is sharing hers.
Hi.
And if Shehnaz and Lubna, if you wouldn't mind muting while Kate's speaking, in case to avoid any background chatter.
Sure.
Go ahead, Kate.
So I was really lucky in the way that I got to have the birth that I wanted. And I say that with some hesitancy because it was definitely not what I had anticipated. There were pieces that I wish that I had more information about going into it. But I had a birth center birth. I birthed in the water. I got to do an entirely unmedicated birth. It was 45 hours long. And then he was born vaginally in the water. So yeah, so that was kind of like the preface. I went into it with this sort of mindset that it might be really long. So the first day when I started to go into labor, really early hours of the morning, the contractions felt like little waves in a pool. Like they were just really subtle. And they were always 3 minutes apart the entire labor. Most of the time, or a lot of times you'll hear about women who have like 20 minutes and then they just get consecutively shorter. But mine didn't. And that first day, I remember just bouncing on my ball and I was watching my baking shows and I was just kind of setting myself up. And I'm like, I could be doing this for 4 days. So I'm just gonna really just do my best to pace myself and to nourish as much as possible, to hydrate as much as possible, to rest as much as possible, because I wanted to have the endurance to make it all the way through. And then the nighttime, it really starts to pick up, or at least it definitely did for me. And we went to the birth center and then they sent us back because I wasn't dilated enough. So we had to get in the car and go, and then get in the car and come back. And then that second day, they gave me Benadryl when I was in labor, like a shot of it, which I told them I did not want, even at like a holistic birth center. And the reason that they did was because they wanted to give me the opportunity to sleep. But what happened is I learned how to prepare for each contraction using my breath. So when I knew that a contraction was coming on, I would take a really big breath. And I'd have these really intense breaths all the way to the peak of the contraction. And then I'd start to have cooling breaths on the way down. So sort of like climbing a mountain and going back down. And what the Benadryl did was it made me so tired that I would crash and fall asleep in those 3-minute windows. But then I couldn't take that big breath to prepare. So then my body was it was so much more painful because I couldn't prep the way that I needed to. And then the second day I went in and we birthed and we tried all these different positions and things to make things happen. My acupuncturist came, which was wonderful. The things that I did not expect were how much trauma came up. There's a little bit of narrative around this, but it's a very intense experience, right? So really big things came up for me. The person that I was married to at the time told me that when I was in labor that he didn't want to have our baby. So I was like, okay. So I think, and that's part of like why the process, took so long, because I was so uncertain about all these things now. I thought I had this stable partnership, and then turns out he didn't want to be in it. And so it was really hard. But I was so determined. And then I labored all through that day and then into that night. And I had set up this beautiful birth altar, and I was in the water, just moving back and forth and just so in my zone. And then Jefferson, I started pushing. So there's this really distinct difference between when you're in labor and your cervix is dilating, and then when the head has come through. It's like, for me, it felt like a little bit of a pop. It was like, oh, and now I can definitely feel like there's a head in the vaginal canal. And then from there, it was really smooth sailing. I was like, okay, now he's in there. Now my body just does the rest. Your body just like goes into these intense contractions. My doula told me to keep my, if I kept the sounds like internal, it could help the progression, because during that time, like when you're actually in the contraction, like baby moving down the canal, it's frequent that we'll want to like externally moan, or like we have sounds that happen. And so I like tried to kind of take those internal. And after 45 hours of labor, I was like, this baby's coming out. So I like kind of rushed the process as much as one can, where I popped his head out like all at once, which gave me a 2nd-degree tear. Don't recommend. But at that point, of course, I was just like, I just need him here. I'm just so excited for him to be here. The midwife was in the other room, and his cord was wrapped around his neck. And so I had a doula there who was also an RN, thank goodness. And she's trying to tell my husband at the time, like, go get the midwife, like the head's, because they were having a medical emergency in the other room. And I was just so in my zone. I was like in this meditative, they said that I sounded like a Hypnobabies tape, because I was just like, don't push, because there's a cord, don't push. And I was just repeating this over and over again. And luckily, like I said, the doula that we had was also an RN. So she slipped her finger around the cord and took it over his head. And then he was born shortly after. And when he came out, the umbilical cord was really tight against the front of my vulva, which can happen if the cord's sort of short. So there was a lot of burning sensation. And then I got out of the birth tub, because if you do birth in a tub, then they'll have you get out afterwards to make sure that everything is clear. And then I birthed the placental, and then they did the fundal massage, which nobody told me about. The fundal massage is terrible. It's the word, in my experience, it's the most painful part of giving birth, which is where they massage your uterus in order to make sure that you're not hemorrhaging and that all of the placenta comes out. No one also told me how bloody it was going to be afterwards, and that I was going to be bleeding for weeks afterwards, which is apparently very normal. But I held him, and then we like tried to get him to latch, and he couldn't, because I had some like inverted nipple issues. And then I remember just really wanting to take a shower. Like, I was like, I know I'm supposed to lay here with him for half an hour, but like for that like initial contact, and I did, for some extent, but I just needed to take a shower. I'd been in a birthing tub with my own amniotic fluid, and all of the things, and I just needed to get clean. So I remember walking, and like, I remember how hard it was to pee the first time. That's something that I didn't get told about, but it's really hard to pee, because you sort of have to just like shift in your pelvic floor, because your pelvic floor just did all of this stuff, contraptions to have your baby. And then I had stitches, which was also probably one of the most unpleasant parts, because it's a really tender area, obviously, especially if you get a tear. Yeah, that was his birth. His birth led to me realizing that the marriage that I was in was not going to be sustainable, and he was not going to be the person who was able to support us. So postpartum was really rough. I did a lot of it alone. The person that I was married to then started to have some trauma and started abusing our son. And so I was in a space of like, I need to get out of this, but I wasn't strong enough. After I did that, my body just needed time, and I was pumping full time, and it was wild. But my strength did come back, and I stopped pumping at 8 months, and we were able to leave, and we're doing really well now. So that was my story. Definitely unique.
Wow. I mean, I had heard Kate's story before, but there's pieces that I did not know. And it really, it moved me the first time, and it moves me now too. Like it's just incredible. Like, giving birth is such an experience, and it, like you said, it's so unique for everybody. Lubna, we're going to hear Shehnaz's story, and then, you know, if you have questions, I know I have like a couple of questions. So yeah, Shehnaz, do you want to take it away?
Hi guys, hi Lubna, and thank you Shubhangini for having me do this. I mean, I've had my first baby 10 years ago, so my memory is probably not as vivid as Kate's. Kate, it was a very interesting and a very, very moving story, but you seem like you have everything under control now, and that's going forth, and that's the best you can do for you. And did you say Jefferson? Sounds like he's lucky, very lucky to have you. So yeah, I could start with where Kate started. I had before Alia, I had a miscarriage. So I'd already freaked out quite a bit reading reviews on Google, information from other people who had had miscarriages. Again, unique situation, just like Kate said. I had my miscarriage on a trip. We'd gone away for 45 days to Europe. Wasn't really backpacking, but I refrained from any seafood or any alcohol. And we covered France, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, and we were in our last destination, Greece. And probably the night before we had to fly out, I had this really weird dream. I don't know how many people I've shared this with. This is very odd, and I know it's going to go on YouTube, but I had this very weird dream of me sitting in a bathroom, and a faucet is on and blood is just flowing out of it. It was like it was a traumatic dream. And my best friend at the time, who was still my best friend, was in the dream in some capacity. And I was like, okay, I'm nervous. And at that time, there were riots going on in Athens. So we just tried to get a sonography in Santorini. It wasn't easy at all. The owners of the resort, which was a small resort, but the owners were very kind. It was a family-owned resort, and the mother, like the matriarch, she took me for that sonography. It was a Sunday, and she found a friend who was a doctor who was ready to come in. And of course, there was no heartbeat. So they recommended that we go to Athens and do a DNC, and I didn't want to because there was unrest everywhere political unrest everywhere in downtown Athens. And so we just bought new tickets, flew out to India, and got I had moved back to India to test out how life would be. I wasn't in the US, so I moved back to India to test out how life would be back home with families. It wasn't working out that great, and this added to the pressure. And then it took me a while to get over the trauma. And however, for me, I don't know, everyone's unique, but for me, having another baby was the only way I would fill that void. And so I kind of blackmailed my husband into trying. He wasn't ready, but I did, because I couldn't think of anything else. And we conceived Alia. We weren't happy in India, so we moved back. I got back here when she was 7 months, when I was 7 months pregnant, to try and make sure that she would be born in the United States. Of course, my husband had a job at that point, so I didn't just come in as a tourist. I know a lot of stories of people coming in as tourists and having babies. I don't want to be one of those. So yeah, I couldn't find work. Obviously, at that point in time, I was big and showing, and I had Alia here, but again, I had a really tough, not a very pleasant experience. I had a 24-hour labor. I'm a researcher, so I was absolutely okay to take any kind of medicine to relieve my pain. So I said, give me that epidural the minute the doctor came. And I had my parents in the room, and my mom was very against the epidural. So that created a lot of conflict between me, her and my spouse at that point, who wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. Emotionally, we were kind of a wreck already because we'd come back and it had been unpleasant experience. So yeah, I took the epidural, and then the epidural gave me chills. I don't think it does that. I think it does that to 30% of the people. I'd been reading about it. And I started developing chills and then eventually developed a fever. And that led to a very, very abnormal heartbeat for Aliyah. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think I had a fever of 104 and she had a heart rate of 100 and I want to say 180. Yeah, it was really high. And my water wasn't breaking. So eventually they manually broke my water and then the cord was wrapped around her neck and she pooped inside me. So there was meconium. It's a horrible story. However, we managed to get her delivered. I had at one point, knowing the stress we were in, mother and child both, requested to do a cesarean and get her out so that at least she would be okay versus I would be okay to bear the pain. I know the recovery is much harder with the cesarean, but I was okay to do that so that she would have some relief, but they refused. And I feel like I did not have a very good doctor, I want to say negligent. I know I don't want to tell you her name, but yes, I think that she was negligent. She would not come to the room when we were asking for her. She was very dismissive to my dad and my husband. And then Aliyah took a little bit to breathe after coming out and cry because she had ingested the meconium. And then she was in the NICU for a bit, but not very long. We were lucky. She was in there for 2 days. It wasn't that bad. However, it created, I couldn't have a latch on the first day. And so nursing wasn't the easiest. She's almost 90% formula fed. She's absolutely healthy right now, but at that point, it was very stressful to not be able to nurse her. And then I feel like my story with Zoya, my second child, is a little better. Another little negligence on the anesthesiologist's part. He left the spinal tap in my spine. It was Christmas, so I'm assuming he was intoxicated. I could smell it on his breath. But eventually, Zoya was a very easy birth. I think the body already knows what it's supposed to do. It loosens up, the pathway loosens up, the birthing canal, and I feel like she came out really quick. I took my time with pushing, and it was very comfortable. However, I think my placenta took a really long time to detach, and that also caused me a lot of bleeding. And I'm already slightly borderline anemic, so that pushed my hemoglobin counts very low, and I had to be very careful during my postpartum. The only other thing I would like to add is postpartum is very hard for everyone, and I think almost every mom goes through PTSD after postpartum, but everyone's PTSD is completely different, so there are different levels of it, and we should never think that someone else's problem is not as difficult as ours. Everyone's problem, everyone's postpartum depression, everybody has it, and everyone's is specific to their own. So when someone is telling you their side of the story, I think we shouldn't quantify how their postpartum depression was as compared to ours, which is something probably learned over my pregnancies. And that's about it. I hope I didn't, if you're going to put this on YouTube, I really hope I don't freak out any expectant moms.
No, I think that's, I think thank you, first of all, both for sharing your stories, because Shehnaz, I'm hearing all of yours for the first time, and it's, wow. Like every time I hear a birth story, the thing I take away most is how incredibly strong women are, because, you know, there's the physical aspect of it, but there's also the emotional aspect of it, which often gets missed because it's just assumed that that's what women do. Like, it's just taken very lightly. But, you know, whether it's having, you know, going through a miscarriage, or it's having a relationship go through something, or, you know, it's it's so much to take in. And like you said, like postpartum, it's its own thing, which is why I'm thinking of doing a postpartum series now. But you know, I think, you know, my story is probably a little bit similar to Shahnaz's, in the sense I ended up having a C-section, 24-hour labor, meconium, temperature, all of that stuff. But, you know, I think, the two similarities I drew from both of your stories was about having partners there as a support system. So Kate, you had a doula, midwife, and your partner, but it was a weird situation with your partner. And then Shahnaz, you had your parents and your husband, and they weren't getting along with the doctors. And so I had a COVID baby, very different. Nobody was really allowed in. I didn't know anything what was going on. So how was it dealing with the conflict, or maybe the uncomfortableness, I can't think of a better word, when, you know, on managing those interactions or those relationships when you're already going on so much in your head and your body? Like, what was the thing that you think helped you, either you just ignore them, or what helped you process or kind of go through that? Like,
Me?
either, both, yeah. Both of you.
So I feel like us coming back from going to India and coming back had already fractured our relationship a lot, between me and my spouse, and then having my parents there was not ideal. I just feel like I shouldn't have called them, and maybe I knew at that point I didn't know that I can do everything on my own, you know, and I wish I'd done that, because when we already came back to a difficult situation, having no money, because we took all our savings to India, and then coming back with a one income, and no money to spend. I mean, initially it was very tight. So having my parents there, and it wasn't the best situation, you know, for them, and obviously for my spouse. But somehow I feel like, I don't know if it's the Indian culture or what it is, like you feel so indebted to your parents, because they brought you up, and, you know, they paid for your education. And so I felt like really sad for them to have to face an uncomfortable situation in my home. Versus the second time, only my mom came in, but we didn't take her to the hospital, and it was way more. It was very comfortable. But of course, we had solved all of us, the entire family had communicated and solved issues by then. And even if she did come, I think it would be fine. But my older one was home. She stayed home with my older one, and it was just Rahul and me in the hospital. I also feel like the dynamics when there are fewer people are so much easier to manage versus when there are more people. I had a doctor from the same practice do Zoya's delivery, and she was absolutely fantastic. And I think that really, you know, kind of pushed. That birth story is amazing because I had a good doctor. I think it really, of course, your practitioner should be good for you to have a good experience, and should be not just good. I feel like, what do you call it? Bedside manner. The bedside manner should be good.
Yeah. What about,
you're already stressed at that point.
yeah.
Get someone who's not understanding how you feel. I know they've been through it several times. The doctors, they do it several times a day. They deliver kids several times a day, and they get jaded, and they see a lot of cases. And for them, that my case is not that complicated, and they've had worse, but they don't let me feel like I'm over exaggerating my situation.
Yeah. Kate, what about you?
Yeah, I just think that you just like the rest of life, you only have space for what you can hold.
Yeah.
And so to answer that original question, it felt like I was aware that things outside of the birth space were going to be crashing down, but I simply just couldn't even process that. All I could focus on was just my breath and my body and my baby. And these unexpected twists and turns happen. I remember my spouse at the time, he took a call. I was like reaching for him for a contraction, and he took a call. And I was like, why are you taking, like, who died? There's no reason that you should be on the phone right now. And there's no, need to go into the story of why he needed to take a call. It wasn't important. But, and I remember all of a sudden this wound in me came up that was like, no one's going to be there for me when I need them, or the people that I love always leave. And it was like those primal wounds that we all have. But when you're in the birth space, they just come up so intensely, like this big trauma bubble. And I remembered like crying and just being like really upset. And I was breathing, and all the practitioners around me like started to try to calm me down. And I realized now, I was like, no, I needed to process that. Like that was a really important and cathartic experience. But I questioned, as many people do, before you go into a birth of like, or when you have a baby, of how is this going to change my partnership?
Yeah.
Are we going to stay intact? Are we going to stay united? Because we had a great year of marriage, and then had a baby, and it went really south really fast.
Yeah.
And sometimes it happens.
Yeah. Wow. Well, the Zoom is going to cut me out in like 8 minutes, but thank you so much, Shehnaz and Kate. Your stories were so moving, and I think they touched on stuff that a lot of times people don't think about this stuff. Sometimes the birth is fine, sometimes everything else falls apart, sometimes it is everything. And so I hope this was helpful for everyone who has watched this. If you guys have questions for Kate or Shehnaz, reach out to me and I will forward it to them so that they can answer it. And join us again in a month, where we're going to have 2 new mummies sharing their stories. So till then, thank you.